Hello, this is Rusty, and I'm watching Lift with Christ about a year ago, who has three questions atheists are afraid to answer, although in the comments there are plenty of atheists who weren't afraid to answer it. Let's listen to the questions.
These are three questions that atheists are afraid to answer.
Apparently not.
And the last question will probably stump you.
No, it won't.
If God isn't real, then how did this entire universe form?
Okay, that's a valid question. Do I need to answer it? No. We can leave that question open. It's perfectly valid to leave that question and say, well, we don't know that yet. So it doesn't necessarily have to stump me as such. I can say, I don't know. And it might be the case that we never will entirely know. Now, there are plenty of hypotheses and theories on the table what might have happened, including that it's always been there. The idea that the universe has always been there hasn't been removed from the table yet, because the part of the universe we see is the observable universe, but we don't technically know that the observable universe is the whole universe. And with inflation, of course, there are parts of the universe that inflated at the Big Bang that we can't see, light can't reach us from its position. So now, so where they are now, light can't get to us now because the universe is not old enough. So it's further away than the age of the universe because we're moving apart. So we only see part of the universe. We don't know it's the whole thing. And there's plenty of ideas about multiverses and bubble universes and other sorts of ideas. There's also the idea that dark energy is related to how the universe formed, as it might be possible, according to recent papers, that matter becomes dark energy in black holes, and it might be the case that what the Big Bang was it happening the other way around. So dark energy before the universe, inverted commas, was formed into energy, normal everyday energy that we experience in our human experience, that cooled into matter at the Big Bang. And that might have been the event that led to our universe, the observable universe. A very interesting idea, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more papers written on that. Grayson did a video on it, if you haven't seen it yet. That'll explain it more clearly than I just did, because he's a physicist and I'm not. So, well, we have answers, just don't know if they're right or not.
Nextly, who was the first man and how were people created?
Well, that is going to be stumping atheists because it's not a valid question. There was no first man. People weren't created. That's what we call a loaded question. It assumes something is true in the formation of the question and forces people to answer it. But when you examine the question, you realize that it's asking you something that isn't true anyway, and then asking you to explain it. The classic example of the loaded question is given in the context of courtrooms where somebody asks a witness something along the lines of, have you stopped stealing mince pies, yes or no? Or have you stopped cheating on your wife, yes or no? Now, the presumption there is that the person has been stealing mince pies or has been cheating on their wife. And if they haven't been, how do they answer the question? Have you stopped cheating on your wife? You haven't been cheating on your wife, so do you say no? And they say, aha. So you're still cheating on your wife? Say, no. So you have stopped? No. And round you go. So this question is an example of a loaded question. So it doesn't stump atheists. It's not valid. It's not a valid question. And the answer actually is that humans are a form of primates and evolved over time from a common ancestor we share with other apes. And all of the apes have common ancestors with New World monkeys and the other the other grouping that we always forget the name of. So there's New World monkeys, there's apes, and there's another one, but I always forget which one it is. And of course, all of us, or the entire I want to say simian, but I think that might be apes as well. The entire group of monkeys, shall we say, Old World, New World, and the other one, we'll just use that loosely because I forgot the right word, are all mammals. And all mammals taken together are all animals. All animals taken together are all eukaryotes. And so we have this cascading tree, and humans just happen to be at the terminus of a particular twig. And humans might split into different groups in the future. But until that happens, we're all the same species. And it would take some sort of unusual event because globalization has made it less likely to happen. There are a couple of different mechanisms for how speciation can happen, and one of those is geographical isolation. Ring species, for instance, are an example of how speciation happens due to geographical isolation. There are a few examples of those that you can look at. So that's why the question isn't valid. What's the next question?
Lastly, if Jesus wasn't born 2023 years ago, then when did we start keeping track of the Common Era calendar year?
Well, that's an interesting question because you used the word Common Era. Now, I think that Kepler first used the term, well, he was German, so we'd have said it in German, full, and that would have been in the 16th century or 17th century, 16th century, I think. And it was first printed in English in the 17th. I might have the centuries one off. It could be the 17th and the 18th centuries. But either way, that's when Common Era came into use. And then after that, before the Common Era, BCE, was adopted to describe things that were before the Common Era. Now, Christians are a little bit frightened by its adaptation. They think it's trying to write Jesus out of the calendar. But in reality, what's happening is that the birth of Jesus isn't known like Christians think it is. They think it was in one, if they're not informed. So, or zero, which is worse because there is no zero. So, Jesus could have been born between 504 BCE and around 4 AD, given the datings in the Bible, the events it describes. Now, there are difficulties in harmonizing those events that are well reported on. But if we just take that range of years, anywhere within that year, you can't date things from a range precisely. You need a fixed point. So what BCE and CE do is they say, okay, well, we'll split the difference and call it zero, because there was no zero in the BC AD schemata. So this fixes that mistake. And it also is universal, it's international. So even people who aren't Christian and have a different faith, like Muslims or Jews or Hindus or Buddhists, are able to use BCE and CE, and people who are Christian know exactly what year they're talking about because they can just use the BCAD as their own system because the two correlate. The only difference is that BCE and CE has been given a point in time where it begins, and BCAD is based on a belief that might be wrong, and it's an indetermined point in history relating to the birth of an individual that we haven't actually established very well. So it fixes a couple of different problems there. Now, you might want to know when the BCAD system came into use, and you have to go back, first of all, to Pope Gregory and the Gregorian reforms, which is the 16th century, for the calendar as we basically know it now. And before that, the Julian calendar had a series of reforms, which were 49 to 44 BC, I think. Yeah, and I'm switching between the two because it really doesn't matter. So that's when Julius Caesar fixed the months, first of all. And it took a little while to get everything back on track because everything was a little bit out of sync prior to that. And before that, they used to date things like by feasts or the reigns of kings or emperors. So when Dionysius Exiguus was around in 525 CE, the Alexandrian Christians were using Anno Diocletian as a dating system, i.e., they were dating events according to the beginning of the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, AD, you see. And Dionysius Exiguus was also called Dennis the Small, which is a little bit easier to remember. He decided that because the Romans had a history at that time, including Diocletian, of persecuting Christians, although there might be an element of legend in that, according to modern historical sources, it might have been a little bit amplified exactly how bad the persecution was in the broader context. There were specific areas of persecution that are well reported, but a more general persecution might not be quite as true as was previously made out. By the by even, Dennis the Small decided he was going to marginalize the Emperor Diocletian, and he was also going to make an attempt to have a universal way of dating the festival of Easter. So he brought in AD, dating to Jesus' birth, as a way of harmonizing different groups of Christians to refer to the same date for the same festival. So that's how AD came about. So it was previously Anno Diocletian, and then in the 6th century it started referring to Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord. And then, of course, events prior to that year were referred to as BC, for before Christ, in English. So this all comes down to the 6th century, and the calendar itself was reformed again by Pope Gregory in the 16th century. Now, before that, this, of course, was Alexandrian Christians had been using Anno Diocletian. The Hebrew calendar had used Anno Mundi, dating from the creation of the world. The Hebrew calendar still does do that. And this is based on a literal dating based on Genesis and the patriarchs and all that kind of stuff, most of which is literary. It never really happened. So that dating schemata doesn't actually work. It's got a non-substantive foundation to it, so it's just floating. And you can't date historical events from something that was imaginary. So the BCE and CE schemata, again, fixes that problem. And it's secular, which means that modern Jewish scholars, modern Israeli scholars, are able to use BCE and CE, even if they tend to use Anno Mundi in their own social groups. So that's the history of how the calendar was developed, and you see that I wasn't frightened by that. And okay, so there was a point in history where somebody was thought to be quite important, and by the 6th century, his importance had grown, and by the 16th century, it was fairly dominant. It doesn't mean that he was God, and it doesn't mean that he was the Son of God. That's just that people had developed very strong beliefs around him and had become a very prominent figure within the Christian movements. Plural, because there was more than one. Well, I think that ties all that up then, doesn't it? I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you again. Goodbye.